Kia ora, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is in Europe this week, attending a North Atlantic Treaty Organisation Leaders Summit and pursuing a free trade agreement with the European Union. Let's examine the significance of that trip. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce. Thank you.
This is the first time that New Zealand has been invited to a NATO summit like this.
Yeah.
Does Jacinda Ardern's participation mark a shift in New Zealand foreign policy?
No, I don't think so. And there's been quite a lot of speculation domestically here in New Zealand that suddenly we were sort of abandoning our independent foreign policy and that we were becoming closely aligned with the United States, and we were being rewarded by included in the NATO summit. The reason that we've had a close relationship with NATO going back decades. In the last decade we signed an informal agreement with NATO, I think it was 2012. John Key went to Brussels and signed it. So this is a long-standing relationship. Why do we tend to get on well with NATO? Because New Zealand's a pluralist democracy which holds international human rights in high esteem. And NATO is a military alliance, a multilateral military alliance, and of course multilateralism is very important to New Zealand, which upholds the international rules-based order, which we also tend to sync with or agree with. So there's a lot of reasons why we would be keen to go, and it's good to have a voice at the table. And it's a momentous time. We're talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made the geopolitical situation in Europe, and indeed the world, extremely challenging, probably the most challenging since 1945. And in addition, we've got, as the Prime Minister pointed out in her speech at the summit, a very challenging situation in the Indo-Pacific as well, with China being identified as acting in an assertive way.
Right, and I want to get to that in a moment. But you're saying this is just a continuation of a friendly relationship with NATO. So why at this time are we being invited there?
I think because there's a recognition that Jacinda Ardern is a young, highly regarded actor, international player. I think a number of countries which are key players in NATO, such as Germany and France, have been very impressed by Jacinda Ardern's leadership, particularly with respect to the aftermath of the Christchurch terror atrocity, and also impressed by her initiative, which she co-launched with Emmanuel Macron, the French leader, Christchurch Call. And also I think many countries, including NATO countries, have been impressed by the way the countries handled COVID-19. We're not the only country from the Indo-Pacific that's been invited. Australia, which is also an informal partner. In fact, they've just upgraded their partnership with NATO. Australia, Japan, and South Korea. So these are the pluralist democracies, the liberal democracies in the Indo-Pacific. They've been invited, and so it's interesting that NATO has actually sort of, if you like, expanded its area of concern quite formally to the Indo-Pacific, and it's also interesting that NATO is in the process of redefining its understanding of international security. It's coming up with a new security concept, and part of that process is they no longer talk about Russia being a partner. They talk about Russia as being a direct threat to the security of the countries that comprise NATO.
Right. I want to pick up on that because on the fringes of that summit, Ardern is meeting with these other leaders that you mentioned, the leaders of Australia, South Korea and Japan, to discuss what's been termed the key security issues for the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
Interesting that that's happening on the edge of a summit, of a NATO summit. So, and you said that you feel that NATO is expanding its area of interest to include our region?
I don't think we're going to get a local version of NATO in the Indo-Pacific. We already have AUKUS and we have the Quad. I think NATO still sees itself essentially as a transatlantic security-based organisation, but there is a recognition by NATO that it can't be indifferent to the challenges to the rules-based international order, and they see now China. See, another interesting thing, Bruce, is that NATO for the first time is identifying China as a major security concern. And they've always avoided that in the past. So I think, to answer your question, I don't think there's going to be a formal expansion of the organisation, but they've certainly been involved for some time in the Indo-Pacific region on security questions. Let me give you an example. The problem of piracy around the coast of the Horn of Africa led to a sort of out-of-theatre operation by NATO, and in which New Zealand participated in that naval operation. So I think many of the key players in NATO, such as Germany, are also very important actors in the Indo-Pacific. Second or third biggest exporter in the world, has close trading relations with China, and like New Zealand is concerned about what appears to be an increasingly China-centric and more assertive policy under Xi Jinping.
This trip to Europe is about more than the NATO summit.
Yeah.
What are the key strategic and economic reasons for Ardern making this trip?
Well, I think strategically, Jacinda Ardern has probably picked up on the fact that some members of NATO, including France, we believe, have flirted with the idea, although I think it's now been put to rest, of a land for peace deal whereby maybe Ukraine should think about conceding a bit of territory. The argument is, oh look, it's a big country, they can concede a bit of territory to Putin's regime, and that sort of land for peace idea. And that would bring peace, which would be welcome. But I think from New Zealand's point of view, and indeed point of view of the overwhelming majority of NATO countries, that would only be a temporary fix, and it would only invite further territorial demands from Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin made an attempt to grab all of Ukraine. He failed, and giving him part of Ukraine for an illegal invasion might mean that he simply revisits the bigger question later on. How can he, take over the whole of Ukraine? So I think from a country like New Zealand, which is small, which depends on the rules-based order, we want to see clarity about NATO's position in relation to Russia. We want to see probably NATO commit itself, and we are now part of that effort, to rebuffing Russia from Ukraine. It may take a while, but it's important, I think, from New Zealand's point of view, that Mr. Putin doesn't succeed in any shape or form in Ukraine, because it's going to have global reverberations, not least for another country that we are worried about, which is China. China will be watching this situation in Ukraine very carefully. And we've been slightly alarmed as a country by China's comments about Russia's invasion and annexation, or attempted annexation. About 10 days ago, Xi Jinping said that Russia's security concerns in Ukraine were legitimate. And that phrasing was quite telling, and I think sent some concerns there. So that's the strategic concern I think New Zealand has. But I think the economic concern for being in Europe is to have those meetings in Brussels with EU leaders, and also consolidate what Damien O'Connor has called our gold standard FTA free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. We are in the process, protracted negotiations with the EU. It's an important development if we can get a free trade agreement with the EU. It's the biggest, largest single market and most prosperous single market in the world. There's very difficult issues still to encounter, particularly in the agricultural area. But if we can get that one over the line, expanded access to this very big and lucrative market, that will be good. And it will be, the reason it's very important, it's both a strategic and economic imperative, is because we want to diversify our trade away from China. I think there's a perception in this country we've probably got too many eggs in the China trade basket at the moment, and we need to diversify. And this is part of it. And so, I think it's an important visit. And I think the word is going out that the Prime Minister needs to try to extract as good a deal as she can from the EU leadership.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.